On March 19th, 1889, the wind came out of the south at daybreak carrying alkali so fine it hissed against teeth. By noon, the thermometer nailed outside Haskell's Mercantile read 91 in the shade, though there was precious little shade left in Red Bluff, New Mexico territory. Cottonwoods along the dry channel stood silvered and thin, their roots clawing at a water table that had dropped another handspan since February. Somewhere beyond town limits, a mule screamed once and went quiet. Men squinted at the sky as if hard looking might pull rain from it. At the far edge of Red Bluff, where wagon tracks frayed into mesquite and arroyos, Megan Jordan worked in a yard that looked like a junk dealer's fever dream and a quartermaster's prayer. Salvaged iron leaned in careful bundles against a half-sunk adobe house. Rail spikes sorted by length, busted axles in a barrel, bent stove flues, cracked trace chains, and a stack of railroad bolts she could still judge by ring and color, same as she had in Colorado when she was foreman over a bridge riveting gang that hated taking orders from her, but hated failed inspections more. She had learned to hear temper in steel before she was old enough to vote, learned that metal lied with shine and told the truth with sound. A clean high ping when struck meant brittleness if quenched too hard. A dull singing thud meant too soft to trust with load. She could read it with her eyes shut. Out here, people called that witchcraft when they were joking and Jordan fussing when they were not. The sky smelled wrong all that week. Hot dust and old cedar resin with none of the clean wet edge spring ought to have. And Megan kept counting days since real rain. 31. Then 32. By supper hour, Hal Greeley was found on his back near the Arroyo Road, shirt front black with blood and one boot missing. Word moved faster than telegraph in a thirsty town. By the time the sun touched the ridge, every porch had a version of what happened. By full dark, one version won. Tavo Salazar did it, said Wade Purcell, Greeley's foreman, standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon with his hat in his fist and whiskey on his breath. Seen him running from the cut bank, bay horse, red blanket roll. I know what I seen. No one asked why Purcell was 3 miles from Greeley's body and somehow first witness to flight. No one asked why he'd been losing money at cards all week to men now nodding solemnly beside him. Rage likes a simple map and an enemy already named. "Judge ain't due till Thursday," someone shouted. "Then we settle before Thursday," someone else answered. Megan heard the first calls from her yard. She set down the valve stem she was filing and looked toward town, where lanterns were gathering in the street like fireflies in a jar. People said Megan Jordan lived like a badger because her house sat half below grade, cool and dim even in June, with a sod-covered roof and iron-strapped shutters. She had built it that way on purpose. Digging down bought temperature stability and wind resistance for the price of labor. Clay, tamped hard in 12-inch lifts, made walls that could take heat better than pine. Her front door was oak planked over with quarter-inch plate, cross-braced from the inside with a salvaged wagon tongue. Folks laughed that she expected cannon fire from Apache ghosts. She didn't explain that in Colorado she had watched a bridge camp burn in 7 minutes because one lantern tipped in a tent line and wind did the rest. She didn't explain that she had once stood on a timber span listening to iron rivets cool, while men below took a vote on whether to obey her load schedule. They had lost 2 days to mutiny, then nearly lost 6 men when a half-set seam buckled under a test train. She finished the contract anyway, signed her name at the bottom of a completed inspection, and left before dawn with her wages in a flour sack because the company man told her plain, "You're right too often for men who need to look right in front of each other." South suited her better, she'd said. Fewer bosses, more sky. Red Bluff took her money, tolerated her methods, and mocked her projects. She built a buried cistern before she built a proper porch. She roofed her root shed with offset baffles so embers couldn't drop straight in. She dug a narrow drainage trench around her chicken pen and lined it with broken bottle glass set in clay to deter snakes and, if needed, boots. Children called her Mold Jordan and dared each other to touch her iron shutters and run. The only man in town who never mocked her was Eli Booker. Eli's smithy sat off Main in a long shed, dark as a church, with one broad forge, 2 anvils, and a water barrel that never ran dry because he topped it before anything else each morning. He was a big man, quiet in the way old trees are quiet, and he wore his leather apron polished with years of scale and sweat. On weekdays, his hammer marked time for half the town. Plow points, wagon tires, hinge straps, shoeing nails, pump rods, branding irons, cooking cranes, coffin handles when needed. On Sundays, he banked his fire and let silence stand. Megan had first gone to him with a crate of cracked bolts and asked if he'd swap labor for tool time. He looked at her hands, not her face. The calluses told more and said, "You strike true. I strike square. Then we can work." That was the whole ceremony. From Eli, she borrowed what she could not buy: bellows used after dusk, access to the treadle grinder, odd lengths of sound bar stock. He never gave gifts, but he gave terms fair enough to count as mercy. In a town where cash came seasonally and vanished nightly, his ledger kept people alive. Widow Hensley. 2 plow repairs paid in beans after harvest. Mrs. Ruiz. Stove door hinge and latch. Paid half in laundry, half postponed. Ada Crow. Mule shoes. No charge after husband's fever. 3 widows, then 4, then 3 again when one remarried. Eli marked every line in patient block letters and never called a debt in winter. When men on the boardwalk joked that Megan's latest ironclad storm hatch looked fit for a bank vault, Eli only said, "Storm don't care whose roof it takes first." That spring, he and Megan spoke mostly in work shorthand. "Rod's pitted 2 inches from eye. Cut back and scarf? Scarf'll hold till May, not through August. Then we sleeve it." He understood what she meant by through August, through fire season. On the night Hal Greeley was killed, Eli was the only one who ran toward the noise without a bottle in hand. They couldn't find Tavo Salazar. Men kicked in the door of his mother's place and found only blankets, a saint card, and a pair of child shoes under the bed. They dragged in Mateo instead, Tavo's younger brother, small-shouldered, 20 maybe, the stable hand who mended girths with neat stitches and carved toy horses for children from soap bars during slow shifts. "I ain't done nothing," Mateo said, voice cracking on the second word. "Blood answers blood," Purcell said. "You got no law for this," Eli shouted, pushing through the ring at the Cottonwood by the old Well Road. "Judge rides in 2 days. You hold him in the jail and wait." Someone shoved Eli backward. Another voice yelled, "Booker, mind your own kind of business." Eli steadied, took 1 step forward again, and got a rifle butt across the shoulder for it. Mateo was crying now, praying in Spanish too fast to follow. Megan stood at the edge of lantern light with both fists clenched and the cold understanding that one armed woman against 30 drunk men is not rescue. It is another body on a rope. The branch took Mateo's weight with a wet creak. By the time dawn burned white over the bluff, his mother was keening by the tree and no one who had cheered could meet her eyes. The next morning, Eli Booker swept his forge floor, stacked his tongs by size, banked his coal, and nailed his door shut with 6 spikes Megan had sold him 2 winters prior. He hung his apron from the latch like a surrendered flag. By noon, his wagon was gone. No signboard, no farewell. Just silence where the hammer had been. By the end of the week, Red Bluff discovered what a town is when iron stops moving. A pump crank split at the river lot and couldn't be welded. 2 wagon teams threw shoes on the East Road and sat lame until their drivers wrapped hooves in rawhide. A hay-rake tongue cracked and stayed cracked. A gate hinge failed at the Price place, and 70 head drifted overnight. Men cursed the inconvenience and would not say Mateo's name. They cursed Eli for leaving, too, as if he owed them more than they had owed justice. Megan stood in front of the shuttered smithy one evening, thumb pressed to the rough grain of Eli's door, where the new nails brightened the wood. She felt not surprise, but arithmetic. 1 dead innocent, 1 departed smith, 12 essential repairs delayed in 10 days. In a wet year, that meant frustration. In a dry year, it meant funerals. Spring came thin and mean, and by April she stopped waiting for permission. At first she went official. She sat through a town council meeting in the back room of the Mercantile, hat on her knee, and laid out figures on butcher paper with a carpenter's pencil. 2 trench lines, she said, tapping the sketch. North and southeast approaches, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, total length 1,200 yards. Labor crew of 20 can cut it in 5 days with teams. Cost in wages at $1.25 per day, $125. Add shovelware, maybe 10. Sheriff Cullum leaned back, thumbs in his vest. For a fire that ain't here. For the one that will be. Greeley's partner, Len Bostic, snorted. This another Jordan contraption? You trying to buy land under fear? It's public edge, Len. Survey marks are plain. You women get grief and build castles, he said, to laughs from men who owed Eli half a season of unpaid work. Megan set down the pencil before she snapped it. Communal cistern keys, then. 3 lock points, 1 at schoolhouse, 1 at church, 1 at livery. I can build iron spark screens for shingles. 1/4-inch mesh, 1-inch standoff, clay spacers. Material for 1 roof runs about $6 if we salvage sheet. Panic trading, Cullum said. You want the town buying your junk. She looked around the room and saw fear disguised as contempt. To accept her plan, they would have to admit they had destroyed the man who could have done half this work with 1 arm. Admitting that would mean facing the tree. The motion died without vote, so she took private jobs, cash or barter, and hid public infrastructure inside them. For Mrs. Ruiz's pump repair, paid in 4 sacks of flour and 2 days of laundry, Megan sleeved the cracked rod with a 9-inch collar, forged from scavenged wagon tire, hot set with 3 drifted pins. While the pit was open, she laid a side branch of 2-inch clay pipe downhill under the fence line, capped for later connection. For the schoolhouse stove flue, she charged only the tin and rivets, $2.40 by her notebook, and added a trapdoor in the cellar floor, disguised under a coal bin. Beneath it, she dug a low crawl toward the old ice pit, shored with cottonwood scraps and plastered smooth with clay sand mix in a 3-to-1 ratio so it wouldn't slough. Behind the church, she bartered with Pastor Keene, 1 repaired bell yoke for use of the lot. In 3 evenings, she and 2 Mexican boys, cousins of Mateo, hand-dug a cistern throat 5 feet across, 12 feet down to hard caliche, then belled it wider by lantern light. She lined the chamber with fired brick scavenged from a collapsed chimney and sealed joints with lime putty. She cooked herself in a pit kiln, capacity by her chalk marks, near 4,000 gallons when full. She kept notes in a grease-stained ledger. April 22nd. Bought 30 feet of chain. Damaged links. 18 cents per foot from rail camp scrapbroker. April 24th. Traded 1 storm latch for 2 kegs bent nails. April 26th. Paid Tomas Ruiz 75 cents for mule team half-day hauling dirt. April 29th. Received 3 cedar poles, 8 inches diameter, from Crow Place in exchange for roof braces. At night, she set low earthen berms around the poorest cabins first, families least likely to run and most likely to be overrun. Nothing grand, just crescents of tamped soil 18 inches high, 3 feet thick at base, broken at one point for entry and backed by a shallow catch trench. Enough to break ground fire and rolling embers. Enough, maybe, to buy 10 minutes. Men who mocked her by day came quiet after dark. My axle collar split, one would mutter at her gate. "Can you look?" She would nod, name a fair price, and add, "Bring 2 shovels tomorrow dawn. Church lot." Some came. Most did not. Still, the trenches lengthened. By Mayday, from the bluff above town, if you knew where to look, you could see her pattern emerging. Hidden water, hard points, fire break lines, routes between cellars marked by stacked stone no higher than a boot. A system built from salvage and stubbornness, threaded through a town too proud to claim it. At dusk, she passed Eli's locked forge again. Wind moved the apron on the latch, tapping wood like a hand that wouldn't stop knocking. Megan stood a moment, then went home to sharpen shovels for morning. The sky to the south glowed heat white long after sunset. Somewhere out there, cedar waited for lightning. At first light, she set the shovels in her cart, added a coil of chain, 2 mattocks, and the iron punch she used for drifting holes through softened bar. The air was already warm enough to taste. The man who'd promised to meet her at dawn never came. She waited by the church lot long enough for the bell shadow to slide 1 plank width along the fence, then started alone. Caliche fought like weak stone. She broke crust with the mattock, scooped spoil into a tarp, dragged it clear, and cut the trench floor flat by eye. By the time Pastor Keene came out with his collar unbuttoned and his hair still damp from washing, she was 3 yards in and shining with sweat. "You should have rung me up," he said. "You'd have brought your good shoes." He looked at the trench, then at the 2 unused shovels leaning against her cart. "No one else?" "Not yet." He went back inside and returned with his sleeves rolled. He dug awkwardly and earnest, blistering fast. Near mid-morning, Mateo Salazar's cousins arrived. Thomas Ruiz first, Mateo's cousin on his mother's side, then little Nestor carrying a shovel taller than his shoulder, and took over the hard chop work without greeting anyone. They worked in silence except for measurements. "Set your break here," Megan told them, heel marking a shallow notch. "Don't run straight line to the corner. Fire likes a corridor." By noon, they had 30 yards cut and squared. She set grade with a clear hose and a tin cup, siphon leveling from a barrel staved flat and filled at dawn. 1 inch of fall every 8 feet, enough for gravity flow without scouring out clay joints. At the low point, she sank a junction box from repurposed boilerplate, riveted seam to seam with soft iron she'd annealed overnight in her own pit forge. Her forge was no thing of pride. 2 adobe walls waist-high, tuyere pipes scavenged from a stove elbow, bellows made from stitched mule hide and a wagon seat spring. It could not draw heat like Eli's broad fire, and she could not weld heavy stock cleanly without his anvil mass and coal quality. But she could scarf, punch, upset, braze thin fittings, and harden tools if she was patient. Patience she had. She built the manifold behind the church in 4 evenings. First came the header pipe. 3 salvaged lengths of 2-inch wrought with threaded ends, recut by file and die, chased until they seated true. She packed joints with hemp soaked in tallow and white lead, then snugged them with 2 wrenches and a prayer against hairline leaks. Off the header, she branched quarter-turn gate valves made from bronze scraps and reamed nipples. Each branch led to buried clay lines she'd laid under lanes and fences where wagon wheels wouldn't crush them. Second came the hand crank assembly. Flywheel from a broken cream separator, shaft bushed in oak, connecting rod pinned to a piston she turned from mesquite and wrapped in rawhide seal. Crude, ugly, but serviceable if kept wet. She mounted it on a timber frame lagged into stone footings. Pastor Keene painted a scripture on the upright post. Megan left it there, though she would have preferred flow rates and maintenance intervals. Third came access points. She disguised one beneath a horse trough, one under the school coal bin, one inside the livery feed room behind stacked oat sacks. Each had an iron cover with a ring pull and a number stamped by cold chisel. 1, 2, 3. She gave keys to 3 people who did not trust one another: Keene, Mrs. Ruiz, and old Ada Crow. So no single frightened man could lock water from the rest. By the second week of May, her map grew crowded. She redrew it on oiled canvas and pegged it to her wall with nails sorted by length. Berms in brown, cisterns blue, trench segments black, shelter cellars marked in squares with little arrows for ingress and vent. She added a legend in the corner because she expected sooner or later someone besides her would need to read it in smoke. Her days took a rhythm that made pain feel ordinary. Before sunup, haul water and quench ash from the pit forge. Morning, field repairs for pay, axle sleeves, hinge straps, shoe nails peened from cut spikes. Afternoon, dig or lay line on whichever public lot she could access without being run off. Dusk, sharpen, patch, account. She accounted for everything, not because anyone asked, but because numbers were a kind of witness. May 11th to 14th labor hours church line. Paid, 2 loaves, 1.25 cash, 6 pounds beans. May 12th, built spark screen prototype for Widow Hensley roof, 6 by 10 frame, 1/4 inch mesh, standoff 1 inch with clay biscuits. May 13th, replaced flue collar at schoolhouse, added spark arrestor cap, conical, 18-gauge tin with cross baffle. May 14th, cut break around Ruiz and Crow cabins, depth 8 inches, width 24 inches, repack berm where goats trampled. She started teaching while she worked, not speeches, motions. Scrape to mineral soil, not roots. Keep your spoil on town side, not fireside. Wet cloth over mouth buys breath, not immunity. If roof catches, don't chase sparks in open yard. Shut vents, get low, move to cellar. Children picked it up quickest. They copied her lines in dirt with sticks, made little towns and ringed them with trenches, then blew at grass clippings to test spread. Their mothers watched from doorways with expressions halfway between gratitude and fear. Men watched too, from shade. The first time someone knocked down one of her berms on purpose, she knew by shovel marks. 3 cuts too neat for rain slump, heel prints from a square-toed boot, and spit dark in the dust where tobacco had landed. It was around the Jacinto cabin, where 5 slept in 2 rooms, and the roof leaked around the stovepipe. She rebuilt the berm wider than before and drove willow stakes through the crest to hold shape. The second time, they dumped a dead coyote in her trench line by the east lane and left it bloating in the heat. Nestor found it and ran to fetch her, gagging. "Don't pull it with bare hands," she said. "Get the hook." Together they dragged it out, burned it hot, and limed the spot. She said nothing else. Nestor waited for anger like a struck match that didn't come. By June, mockery had organized itself into policy. At council, Len Bostic stood with a folded paper and read in a voice made formal for effect. Any excavation within town limits deeper than 12 inches on public ground. Rights of way or town easements requires prior filing and fee to prevent undermining roads, ditches, and lawful property. "Lawful property," Sheriff Cullum echoed, tapping his badge as if the metal agreed. Megan sat in back until they called for objections. She rose, took off her hat, and said, "You're charging a permit to scratch a post hole now?" Cullum spread his hands. "Order keeps chaos down. Chaos is a roofline ember in 40-mile wind." Laughter lifted along the benches. Bostic squinted at her over the paper. "If your works are so charitable, Miss Jordan, Pay the fee from your charity purse. How much? $5 per dig. That was nearly a week's food for a widow with children. Exactly the point. From then on, she dug on private parcels where permits did not apply and stitched lines through alleys after midnight on town ground where nobody could prove depth. She paid 2 fees when cornered and marked them bitter in her ledger. She refused to stop. Mockery got personal when money got involved. At Haskell's Mercantile, where she'd bought lamp oil on credit 3 winters running and always paid after branding season, Mr. Haskell looked at her account book and said, not meeting her eyes, "Store policy changed. Cash only." "Since yesterday?" He swallowed. "Since council advised caution with unapproved works." "Council advises you're till now." "Don't make me say more." She laid coins on the counter one by one for oil, nails, and salt pork, then picked up her parcel and left while 2 ranch hands by the pickle barrel whispered loud enough to hear, "Mole's building catacombs. She'll tunnel clear to hell and call it drainage." Children began a chant when she passed. "Dig, mole, dig. Hide from wind, hide from God." One of them was Haskell's boy, who had once eaten her jerky on a wagon trip and called her Miss Meg with missing front teeth. He would not meet her look now. At the livery, Wade Purcell started telling anyone who'd listen that she was salting fear to buy land cheap. "She says your roof will burn unless you hire her," he drawled from a hitch rail one hot afternoon. "How convenient she's got iron for sale." Megan, passing with a basket of valve parts, stopped. "I've sold exactly 3 screens in 2 months, Wade. 1 paid in eggs. You hear that?" he called to the men around him. "Predator runs on eggs." They laughed. Purcell tipped his hat at her with a smile too wide for weather this dry. She looked at him a long second, at the way his right hand favored his ribs when he thought nobody watched, at the new silver concho on his gun belt that a foreman's wages didn't explain. Then she walked on. Institutional contempt had paperwork. Casual contempt had free time. Either could kill. Sheriff Cullum began riding by her place at random hours, reins loose, pretending to inspect for code violations no one had ever written before. Once he dismounted and kicked her stacked rail bolts with the toe of his boot. "Unsafe pile," he said. "Gravity still legal? Don't get smart. I don't have to get what I already am." He narrowed his eyes, then noticed the iron shutters on her half-sunk windows, the packed dirt roof, the water barrels shaded under canvas, and the trench line she'd cut around her own yard to bare mineral. Fear flickered across his face before pride put it away. "You planning for siege, Jordan?" "Planning for weather. Looks the same from where I sit." "That's because where you sit has never been asked to hold." He mounted and left dust where his horse stamped. That evening, someone drove 2 nails into her gatepost and hung a frayed length of rope from them, short and mean. She took it down, coiled it, and used it next day to haul stone for cellar bracing. By mid-June, women had started coming to her quietly in 2s and 3s. Mrs. Hensley brought a pie and asked, "If my roof catches, where do I take Clara?" "School cellar nearest. If wind from south, church cellar safer. If both routes blocked, your root pit, if you wet blankets first." Ada Crow, whose hands shook with age but not with indecision, said, "Teach me the pump." Megan taught her crank rhythm, steady half-turns, don't race and cavitate, then had her train 2 teenage girls at sunset, while men played cards 30 yards away pretending not to see. Even contempt could not keep thirst from arithmetic. Wells were dropping, pumps sticking. Without Eli, repairs lagged into breakdown. People who mocked publicly now sought private maps. Megan copied route sketches onto scraps of feed sack with charcoal and grease pencil. "Only if needed," she told each person. "Don't panic run and clog lanes. Move in order." "Order?" Ada snorted. in this town. Borrow it from me till they grow their own. Then came the signs she could not nail down or legislate around. The first was in the cottonwoods. Leaves flipped undersides by noon and stayed that way, pale as fish bellies, though no storm front followed. The second was in the ants, carrying eggs uphill in tight, frantic lines from low ground to porch steps. The third was sound, or the lack. Meadowlarks stopped in the south fields for 2 mornings running. Even the flies seemed to hug shade. On June 21st, she set a shallow pan of water by her door at dawn and checked it hourly. Old rail camp trick for reading evaporation. By noon, the pan had dropped a finger width. By sunset, 2. Relative humidity would have been in the teens if anyone in Red Bluff owned such a gauge. She had only skin and memory, and both said tinder. That afternoon, she walked the ridge south of town with a strip of wool tied to a willow wand. At ground level, wind moved east. 10 feet up, it pulled steady north. She watched dust devils lift in pairs from the flats, twist apart, then recombine like rope strands. She muttered numbers under her breath. If surface gusts go 30 with low moisture, and flame length reaches 10 feet, spot fires can jump twice. Road width easy, more in cedar. Near sunset, heat lightning flickered beyond the cedar breaks. Sheet flashes with no thunder reaching town. Dry storms, rain falling high, burning off before it touched earth. She saw virga hanging like gray curtains that never reached the ground, and felt the hair on her forearms rise from static. At supper in the boarding house, she said, to nobody in particular and everybody there, "You get lightning south with no rain. You post riders and wet roofs. Tonight." A drover at the far table laughed into his beans. "You hear that? Mole says wet your roof every time God blinks." Another man added, "Maybe she'll sell us thunder permits." Even Pastor Keene hesitated. "Could be just heat, Megan. Folks are tired." Tired burns same as rested. She stood, left half her stew untouched, and walked to the door. On the threshold, she turned back. If wind shifts after midnight, ring the church bell 3 times fast, not once, 3. No one answered. She spent the night on her roof with a blanket, a spyglass, and 2 buckets beside the stovepipe. Around 1 in the morning, she smelled it. Not smoke yet exactly, but scorched resin riding high air from far south. She marked the direction, checked again an hour later, and found it stronger. At dawn, she went door to door through the poorest row first, knocking with the iron ring from an old harness. "Pack a bundle and keep it by the door," she told each family. "Water jar filled. Shoes where your feet can find them in dark. If I send word, you move fast, and you move together." By the time sun cleared the bluff, men on Main were already joking again, because daylight makes danger feel theoretical. But over the southern horizon, a brown smear lay flat and long where sky ought to have been clean, and every now and then, too faint for most to notice, the wind carried that bitter cedar smell another notch closer. By sundown that same day, the brown smear had thickened into a long, level bruise along the southern rim, too wide to be cookfire smoke and too steady to be dust alone. The air felt woolly in the throat. Chickens in 3 yards went to roost early and would not be coaxed down. Megan stood on her roof with the spyglass and watched heat shimmer flatten the horizon. Every few minutes, a faint pulse of lightning moved behind the cedar breaks, silent at this distance, white as sheet metal. She timed between flashes out of habit anyway. No thunder. Dry charge. On June 24th, she walked Main at dawn and told anyone who'd listen. Smoke column south-southwest, maybe 15 miles out. Could stay in breaks if wind holds. Could run if it doesn't. By noon, men were already saying it had burned itself out. By evening, ash the size of moth wings drifted into town, and settled on water troughs in gray crescents. The next 4 weeks wore Red Bluff down to nerves and powder. July gave them 23 days over 100 degrees. The thermometer at Haskell's hit 104 on July 9th, 101 on July 14th, 106 on July 20th. Humidity stayed so low, wet shirts dried stiff in minutes. 2 small range fires started and died north of the arroyo. People took that as proof Megan exaggerated everything. Council fined her once more for unpermitted trenching. Len Bostic called the citation a victory for sanity from the hitch rail, while his men stacked loose hay against his south barn wall, exactly where a spark would want it. On Friday, July 26th, a rider from the Ute camp passed through at dusk, pointed his chin at the sky, and said to nobody in particular, "Tomorrow or next, south wind comes hard after lightning." Saturday, July 27th, 1889, began at 5:30 a.m., already 82 degrees. By 1 p.m. it was 107 in the shade, and shade was scarce as mercy. At 2:40 p.m., thunderheads built over the southern ridges, high anvils with black bellies and pale veils of rain that evaporated half a mile above ground. At 3:10 p.m., the first dry strikes hit the cedar breaks in a ragged line. Town heard thunder then, late and angry, rolling hollow across the flats. At 4:05 p.m., Tomas Ruiz came running from the south lane, hat gone, chest heaving. "Fire in the brakes," he shouted before he reached Maine. Not one, 3 fronts, wind pushing north. At 4:20, the south wind arrived like a door kicked open. Dust hit first, then heat, then embers. By 4:35, every church window rattled. By 4:40, sparks were landing on Red Bluff's south roofs. "Bell!" Megan yelled at Pastor Keene, already running. "3 fast!" Keene took the rope with both hands and rang 3 sharp peals that cut through wind and shouting. People froze half a second, long enough for recognition, and then the street broke into motion. Women hauling children, men dragging barrels, mules screaming at their tethers. Megan sprinted to the church manifold, dropped to one knee, and spun open valve 1. Nothing. She cranked the pump, once, twice, 3 times. A stuttering cough of brown water spat, then steadied into a thin stream. Not enough pressure. Somewhere upstream, one junction had silted or collapsed. "Keep turning," she barked at Nestor, shoving him onto the crank. "No stopping unless it locks." At the main well lot, a crowd had already formed around the rig. Men threw their weight on the handle while Sheriff Cullum shouted conflicting orders and tried to sound in charge. The rod shrieked in its guides, seized, then jerked free with a bang that echoed off storefronts. On the second pull, it snapped near the eye. The very pitted section Megan and Eli had once flagged, "Not through August." The broken end whipped sideways, tore through Deputy Arlo Finch's sleeve, and drove iron into his neck above the collarbone. He dropped without a cry, hands still wrapped around the handle. Blood ran bright down the well curb and turned black in the dust. For one stunned beat, the whole lot went silent except for wind. Then panic did what panic does. Men let go and backed away as if the broken machine had chosen him on purpose. "Leave the rig," Megan shouted from the lane. "Go to church line and school line. Move." Some obeyed. Some didn't hear. Some heard and hated that she was right. The first structures went at 5:02 p.m. The south feed sheds near the livery, dry boards, and old chaff, flames climbing in sheets up the walls. At 5:11, sparks caught Bostic's haystacks. His men tried beating them with saddle blankets, but the wind lifted burning flakes over their heads and dropped them onto the barn roof, the corral fence, the wagon tarps. In less than 6 minutes, his pride, the biggest red-painted barn in the district, was fully involved, roof venting fire like a forged chimney. Horses kicked through a side gate and bolted riderless down Main, manes smoking. "Save the house!" Bostic screamed at no one and everyone, face gray under soot. His house did not save. At 5:28, Ember Wash found the porch curtains and took the whole front gallery. The painted trim blackened, blistered, peeled. Bostic stood in the road watching his parlor windows explode outward, and whatever authority he had carried on town council blew out with that glass. Megan's works held in places and failed in others, exactly as she had feared. The berm at the Jacinto cabin stopped ground fire cold for 7 minutes. Then a rolling tumbleweed already burning vaulted the low section someone had once cut down in spite. Flame dropped behind the berm and ran the porch skirts. Mrs. Jacinto got her youngest out through the back because Megan had insisted months ago on widening that rear step. The schoolhouse spark screen did its job until someone, months earlier, had removed 2 clay standoffs to patch a chicken coop. The loose corner warped under heat and let embers in. Smoke filled the attic. Children sheltering in the cellar began to cough and retch until Megan sent 2 boys up with wet flour sacks to pin the gap. The church cistern gave good flow for 23 minutes, then valve 2 jammed half open with grit. Ada Crow, 70 if she was a day, knelt in the mud with pliers in her bare hands and worried the stem back and forth while sparks pattered across her shawl like hard rain. She got it turning. She also got her sleeves lit. Thomas smothered one arm with his hat. The other burned through to skin before they could douse it. By 6 p.m., Red Bluff was a map of moving crises, roofs catching and being beaten out, sheds collapsing, livestock loose, mothers counting heads and recounting. Smoke lowered to window height. You could taste nails in it. At Haskell's Mercantile, Ruth Haskell was still upstairs when the back stairwell lit. She had gone to fetch the account books and a tin of cash, because people in disaster reach for what they believe proves a life. Her husband reached the landing as a beam failed over the storeroom door. Witnesses said he heard her once through the smoke. Sam. Then not again. He came down carrying only one scorched ledger, and both hands burned to blisters. By dark, he sat in the gutter rocking, whispering inventory line items like prayer, lamp oil, flour, axle grease, coffee, salt. Ada Crow died at 7:10 p.m. in the churchyard, not from burns but from smoke she had swallowed while keeping the jam valve alive. She pressed the iron key ring into Megan's palm with a hand gone papery and said, matter of fact even then, "Don't let one fool lock water." Then she coughed twice, looked toward the school where girls she'd trained were still pumping, and went still before Megan could answer. The third death came mean and fast. Little Clara Hensley, 8, thin as kindling, one braid half undone, broke from the cellar line when she heard her dog crying behind their cabin. Mrs. Hensley lunged, missed her sleeve, screamed for someone to grab her. Purcell ran 3 steps into the smoke after the child and turned back when a wall of heat punched out from the alley. Tomas Ruiz went farther, face wrapped in wet cloth, found Clara by the rain barrel with the dog under her arm, and shoved both toward open ground. The dog lived. Clara did not. Heat had taken her lungs before flame touched her dress. Mrs. Hensley held her on a wet blanket while embers snapped around them and would not put her down, even when Megan begged her to move to shelter. Night did not cool things. It made them worse. At 8 p.m., the temperature in town center was still 96, with gusts near 40 miles per hour out of the south, according to a railroad man who swore by his pocket gauge. Firebrands crossed streets like thrown stars. The sky over Red Bluff turned a dirty orange bowl, low enough to feel. People who had mocked Megan's catacombs now packed into the cellar network she dug under school and church and 2 private root sheds. Those without access crowded ditches with wet quilts over their heads, praying sparks chose other roofs. The contrast was obscene. One block where shutters dropped and water lines hissed, another where families fought fire with dishpans because no one had paid for pipe or planning. By 8:25, both official authority and social rank had melted. Sheriff Cullum's horse came up Megan's lane lathered white and wild-eyed. Cullum himself looked 10 years older than he had at noon, soot striped into the creases beside his mouth. Wade Purcell rode behind him bareheaded, eyebrows singed off, shirt half burned away at one shoulder. 2 councilmen stumbled on foot behind them carrying nothing but canteens. Cullum reined hard at her gait and didn't dismount at first, as if the saddle still granted him office. "Jordan," he shouted over the wind. His voice cracked on her name. "Maine's gone on the south side. Well, Riggs dead. We can't hold it." She stood in her yard with ash in her hair. One glove burned through at the thumb and said nothing. Purcell slid down from his horse and nearly fell. "Feed store roof dropped," he rasped. "Men trapped, maybe 3. Fire's jumping the east lane now." Cullum swallowed. Pride fought him. Lost. He swung down, took 2 stumbling steps and came to a halt just outside her trench, as if asking leave to enter a church. "Tell us what to do," he said. "Not help us. Not please. Just the stripped core." Megan looked past them at town, at sparks pouring over roofs, at people running bent double with wet blankets, at the church bell rope still swinging from the last alarm, at the smoke column eating stars. Then she nodded once. "Open your jail powder," she said to Cullum. "All of it. Bring kegs here. We'll set backburns on my mark, not before." To Purcell, "You can stand?" He nodded, ashamed and shaking. "Good. You're on shovel line. No gun. If I see whiskey on your breath, I tie you to the pump." To the councilman, "Get every hand that can hold a crank to churchyard and school line. Women too, boys too. Nobody waits for permission." Cullum started to speak. She cut him off. "And hear me plain. My cisterns are open. No payment, no papers, no names asked. You send anyone with buckets, they draw." For half a second, all 4 men stared at her like they had never seen her before. Then she picked up Ada Crow's keys, shoved past them through her own gate, and ran toward the fire with the mob at her back. The first backburn went down crooked because men wanted to rush it. "Not there," Megan shouted, grabbing Sheriff Cullum's sleeve and yanking him 3 feet left as sparks skated past their boots. "You light on that line, wind'll throw it straight into Keene's sheed. Scrape first." "To dirt." I said dirt. Powder kegs from the jail sat in a row by her trench, stenciled U.S. in flaking white. She'd split each keg into canvas charges and tamped them shallow along a strip she'd chosen months ago, where bare ground and low berm could carry a controlled burn without jumping. Men who had once laughed at her crouched with fuse lengths in shaking hands. "Short fuses if you want to die," she snapped. "Cut to my thumb and a half. Lay your caps downwind. When it catches, you step back, not forward. Fire eats oxygen first and fools second." Purcell's face was black with soot, eyes raw and wet from smoke. He obeyed without argument. Megan struck the first match on her belt buckle and touched it to the lead. A hiss, a spit, then 3 quick concussions rolled low across the lane. Dry weeds flashed and laid over, flame running away from town into the wind-starved strip she'd prepared. Men flinched at the blast, then stared as the blackened line widened exactly where she had promised it would. "Now shovel the edge," she yelled. "If a coal crosses, you bury it. Don't swat, bury." They moved. At churchyard, girls and grandmothers took turns on the hand crank until their shoulders trembled. Nestor counted cadence like a drummer. 1, 2, 1, 2. Water thudded through the header and spat from hose ends into bucket brigades. "Mrs. Ruiz, skirt hem soaked to the knee, slapped a younger man's hand away when he tried to cut in. She said steady, Ruiz barked. You race, it locks. Wait your turn. At schoolhouse, two boys dragged wet burlap over the roof seam where the spark screen had warped. Pastor Keene stood in smoke up to his chest, passing up sacks, coughing blood-flecked phlegm between orders and prayers. Down Main, expensive things failed loudly. Bostic's painted barn collapsed in a fan of cinders, brass weather vane dropping into coals with a soft metallic sigh. Haskell's fancy new plate glass front cracked from heat and burst inward. The livery's imported tar roofing melted and dripped flaming ropes into the alley. On the poor row, Megan's ugly berms, raw dirt and bottle glass and willow stakes held, not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough. At 9:10 p.m., someone shouted from the feed store. Still one inside. The south wall had fallen, the roof sagging hard to the east. Grain dust and smoke made the air thick as wool. Purcell lunged toward the opening. I got him. You don't got breath, Megan said, catching his arm. She shoved a wet cloth over his mouth and tied it behind his head. 30 counts in, 30 out. If I drag you, you walk. If I drop you, you crawl. He nodded once. They went in low beneath a beam that cracked like a rifle shot overhead. Inside was red dark and sparks, sacks burning slow at the corners, a mule kicking against broken harness. Not a trapped worker, just panic and heat and noise that made thought ragged. Then the beam at the rear gave way. Purcell turned toward the crash and the floor punched down under him where joists had burned through. He dropped thigh-deep, screamed, and vanished in smoke. Megan went after the sound, blind but for ember glow. She found his wrist by hitting it with her shin. He was wedged between splintered planks, boot-pinned. Fire climbed the wall behind them with a hungry, rushing sound. Leave me, he coughed, half sob, half command. Leave me, Jordan. Not tonight. She hooked chain under his trapped boot heel, looped the other end around a post stump, and set her back against a scorched feed bin. No leverage. She reset, braced one foot against the floor edge, and hauled until her shoulder felt like it tore. The boot came free with a sucking pop and a smell of burned leather. Purcell rolled clear, gagging. Crawl! The roof gave a long groan. She shoved him toward the opening, then dove after as something heavy crashed where her hand had been an instant before. They tumbled into the lane together, both coughing black. Cullum and Thomas grabbed Purcell and dragged him farther from the wall. Megan stayed on her knees for 3 breaths, palms in dirt, then stood and pointed back to the bucket line. No heroics, she rasped. Drown exposures only. Let the store go. Nobody argued. By midnight, Red Bluff was a ring of ember, mud, and moving shadows. The south edge smoldered. North roofs steamed. People packed the cellars in shifts, rotating out to work pumps and trench lines when called. Megan moved among them with Ada's key ring on her wrist, opening every lock she'd ever set. She handed out what she had without counting first. Salt pork from her root pit, dried beans, 2 sacks of flour, lamp oil, clean cloth strips, a barrel of water she'd put by for herself in April. When one man tried to press coins into her hand, she closed his fingers around them and pushed them back. Buy nails when morning comes, she said. Tonight you carry water. A teenage drover stood frozen at the schoolhouse hatch, staring at firelight and clutching a Bible like it might stop heat. Megan took it from him, set it on a barrel, and put a shovel in his hands. Scrape here, she said, guiding his first stroke, to pale dirt. Good, again. Fear's fine. Still dig. Near dawn, the wind eased just enough to hear individual voices again. The main front passed north of town into scrub already half burned by backfires. Red Bluff did not look saved. It looked flayed, but it stood. When the sun came up through smoke at 5:41, 3 dead lay under wet sheets in Churchyard. Deputy Finch, Ada Crow, Ruth Haskell. 32 injured, including Clara Hensley, who lay in the church cellar with her arm splinted and her breathing watched by shifts. 17 homes damaged, 6 gone. Bostic's barns gone. Feed store gone. Mercantile gutted but standing. School and church blackened. Cellars intact. Cullom took off his hat beside Ada's covered form and didn't put it back on for a long time. They buried their dead the next evening because in heat like that, grief had a timetable. No one asked Pastor Keene to shorten the service. No one joked. Mrs. Hensley stood between 2 women, one arm around Clara wrapped in quilts and the other braced at her own ribs, while the girl coughed softly into a damp cloth. Finch's younger brother kept touching the deputy's belt buckle, then pulling his hand back like it burned. Mr. Haskell, both hands bandaged, stood at Ruth's grave with his hat crushed flat in his grip. When they lowered Ada, 3 girls she'd trained on the pump laid their palms on the shovel handles before the first dirt went in. After the graves were covered, people remained in the yard, not ready to disperse into char and repair. Smoke still sat in the alleys. Every face was scraped raw by wind and sleeplessness. Cullom cleared his throat. Town meeting at courthouse. Noon tomorrow. Everybody. Len Bostick, arm in a sling, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Soot had aged him. For relief allocations and rebuilding priorities, he began, voice trying to recover old authority. A sound ran through the crowd, small but unmistakable, not agreement. Megan, standing near the cistern throat with Ada's keys at her side, said, "Noon tomorrow for testimony first." Bostick frowned. "This ain't the time for side matters." Mateo Salazar is not a side matter. Silence dropped so hard you could hear cinders settling in a ruined eave 2 blocks away. Bostick opened his mouth, then shut it. Purcell, on crutches with his burned shoulder bandaged, stared at the ground and did not move. At noon, the courthouse was too hot, so they gathered under a shade fly stretched from hitch rails and window hooks. Judge Elias Hardin arrived in a dust-coated carriage 20 minutes late, circuit docket tied in ribbon on his lap. He stepped down, took one look at Red Bluff's scorched south face, and said quietly to his clerk, "Strike routine business." The clerk swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor." Hardin had expected property disputes and branding claims. Instead, he got a town with smoke in its clothes and murder in its throat. Cullom called the meeting to order without swagger. Judge Hardin presiding. Matter 1. Death of Mateo Salazar by mob action, March 19th. Related matter. Death of Hal Greeley. Witnesses called. Megan walked to the front carrying a tin lockbox and her grease-stained ledger. "Your Honor," she said, "I have physical evidence and records relevant to both." Hardin nodded. "Proceed." She set items one by one on the table. A spent .44 casing wrapped in cloth. A cut trace chain with fresh filed break at one link. Eli Booker's account book, corners charred where she had snatched it from the shuttered forge during the fire night when she needed nails and found more than iron. "I found the casing and chain at the hanging tree in May," she said. Murmurs rippled. Chain link matches a drag setup used to move a body short distance without horse marks. Filing pattern is recent to time found. She tapped the casing. This was fired from a .44 with a chipped extractor mark. Hal Greeley carried such a revolver. Sheriff can confirm. Cullom nodded once, jaw tight. Confirmed. She opened Eli's ledger to a marked page. Entry dated March 19th, 6:15 p.m. Hal Greeley, shoe reset, bay gelding. Paid cash, whiskey smell, with Purcell, Bostick, and Danner at forge. Hardin looked up sharply. Body was reported found at approximately 5:30. By Purcell, Megan said. All eyes turned. Purcell stood in the crowd on his crutches, face ashy under healing burns. He shook his head once, tiny as if refusing himself. Hardin fixed him with a courtroom stare. Mr. Purcell, front. Purcell did not move. Cullum took one step toward him. Wade. Purcell flinched like struck and hobbled forward. When he reached the table, he put both hands on it to steady himself. His knuckles were blistered and split from pump handles and shovel shafts. Swear him, Hardin said. After the oath, Hardin asked, Did you see Tavo Salazar flee the arroyo as sworn? Purcell's mouth worked. No sound. Hardin waited. Finally, Purcell whispered, No, sir. Hardin leaned in. Speak so. All may hear. No, sir, Purcell said louder, voice breaking. I didn't see Tavo. I seen smoke from my own cigar, and I seen Hal on the ground after. That's all. A collective exhale hit the shade fly and made it tremble. Then explain your sworn statement. Purcell closed his eyes. Hal was alive at 6. We was at Booker's, then Cards behind Bostic's barn. Hal was drunk and mean. Argued over water lots and marker stakes. Reached for his gun laughing. Said he'd teach him to sign over cheap. Gun went off in the scuffle. Hit him high chest. He swallowed hard. Danner grabbed me. Said if word got out we was drinking and fighting over deeds, we'd lose claims and maybe hang for manslaughter. Bostic said blame Tavo. Everybody already hated horse thieves. We moved Hal to Arroyo Edge with chain. Broke one link dragging. Then I swore what they told me. Mrs. Salazar made a sound from the back, half gasp, half animal moan, and 2 women held her upright. Hardin's face went still as carved stone. And Mateo Salazar. Purcell looked toward Mrs. Salazar, and then away as if the sight scorched him more than fire had. I told myself mob would scare him, maybe jail him till judge came. Then rope went up. I didn't stop it. You let it, someone shouted from the crowd. Purcell bowed his head. Yes. Hardin turned to Len Bostic. Stand. Bostic rose slowly, sling hanging neat and clean, unlike everyone else's rough bandages. Your Honor, this man is delirious from injury. We all near burned to death. Hardin cut him off. Did you or did you not participate in moving Mr. Greeley's body and fabricating testimony? Bostic spread his free hand. I deny. Kulam stepped forward with another book in hand. Your Honor, I have supplementary record. He held up land filings. 3 quitclaim drafts prepared 2 days before Greeley's death, transferring Salazar family water lots to Bostic cattle under debt pressure, unsigned. Witness line blank. He looked at Bostic without blinking. Motive established. Hardin did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Marshal. 2 territorial deputies moved in from the carriage shadow and took Bostic by both arms. Danner tried to bolt, got 3 steps and tripped over a hitch rail to immediate custody. As chains clicked, Hardin addressed the crowd. This court finds probable cause for charges of conspiracy, perjury, obstruction, and unlawful killing in the death of Mateo Salazar. Further hearings will be held under guard in Santa Fe if necessary. Effective immediately, Red Bluff's self-appointed vigilante committee is dissolved by territorial authority. No prisoner within this jurisdiction will be harmed or executed before formal hearing under pain of federal charge. Sheriff Cullum, enforce it. Cullum, pale and hollow-eyed, said, Yes, Your Honor. Hardin looked to Mrs. Salazar. Ma'am, this court cannot restore your son. It can stop pretending not to know what was done. She stepped forward, hands shaking, and touched Mateo's name where Keene had written it on a scrapboard set against the courthouse wall. He fixed saddles, she said to no one and everyone. He sang to my goats. He was kind. No one answered. No one deserved to. 2 nights later, after arrests and inventories and a rainless sunset red as a wound, the town asked Megan to the courthouse again. This time, benches were full before she arrived. Pastor Keene stood first. "Megan Jordan, this town owes you lives." He held up a new tin star on black leather. "Council vote to appoint you acting sheriff pending election." Murmurs of approval. A few faces looked relieved as if this could balance accounts. Haskell, hands bandaged white and voice thinned by smoke and fresh mourning, rose next. Also, deed remission on the Jordan parcel and adjoining lot as gratitude from Merchants Association. Plus contract priority for all municipal works, added one councilman quickly, eager. Megan remained standing near the door, hat in hand, soot still ground into the seam of her sleeve that no washing removed. She looked at the star, the deed papers, the hopeful faces and ashamed ones, and shook her head. "No." Keene blinked. "No to which?" "All of it." A rustle went through the room. "I don't want your badge," she said. "I watched what power without humility did in this town. I'm not putting that on my chest." Cullum, seated in back, stared at his knees. "I don't want free land bought with guilt. Keep it public, or sell it fair." She stepped closer to the front table and set Ada's keyring down beside the star. The iron clinked once. "I want 3 things, written, signed, and filed where no wind can blow it off a board." Hardin's clerk uncapped his pen. "First, compensation to Mrs. Salazar from the estates and seized holdings of Bostic and Danner, not charity damages. Monthly, enough to live with dignity." Mrs. Salazar covered her mouth with both hands. "Second, reopen the forge as public utility, named Booker Forge, with wages set by skill not skin, and a ledger that keeps winter credit." At Eli's name, a few men shifted, embarrassed. "Third, apprenticeship seats, paid seats, for Mexican, black, and tribal youths in smithing, masonry, pump work, and fire lines. Not token, not one season, and forgotten. Permanent." She looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one, including those that had mocked her loudest. "You want to thank me? Don't hand me symbols. Build systems." Silence held for a beat. Then old Mrs. Ruiz from the second bench said, "I second." Pastor Keene, voice rough, said, "So moved." Cullum stood slowly. "I vote aye." One by one, hands rose, even hands that had once held rope. The motion passed unanimous. Megan picked up her hat. "Then we're done for tonight. Sunrise trench repair at South Lane. Bring shovels." A tired laugh moved through the room. Small, real, almost human again. The first ring of hammer on new anvil came in October. They had rebuilt the forge in adobe and brick with a high-vent hood, spark arrestor cap, and a cistern line tied into Megan's manifold. Over the door hung a sign painted by schoolchildren in careful block letters. Booker Public Forge. Work, credit, and instruction. On opening morning, half the town crowded the street pretending they had business. Mrs. Salazar stood near the hitch rail in a black shawl. Thomas and Nestor flanked her in clean shirts, trying to look older than they were. Megan waited by the anvil, arms folded, saying little. A wagon rolled in from the north road just after 9. Driver hat pulled low against sun. He set brake, climbed down stiffly, and turned. Eli Booker looked thinner, grayer at the temples, but his hands were the same. Broad, scarred, steady. He took in the sign, the rebuilt hood, the line of children craning to see, and Megan by the anvil. "You moved my shop," he said. "Yours walked off," she answered. A beat. Then Eli's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He stepped inside, hung his old apron, patched but oiled, on a fresh peg, and laid one palm on the anvil face like greeting a grave and a newborn both. He looked back at Mrs. Salazar and dipped his head. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She nodded once. "Teach them well." He lit the forge. By noon, he had 3 apprentices at stations. Tomas on tongs, a black girl named Lila Finch, Deputy Finch's niece, at the bellows, and a Ute boy called Casa, measuring bar stock with a carpenter's square Megan had filed true herself. "Heat's not a color. It's a range," Eli told them. "Watch the shadows in the steel, not the glow." Megan corrected stance, shoulder width, and grip. "Hammer falls from elbow, not wrist. Let tool do work." No one laughed at instruction anymore. That winter, council posted and enforced the new ordinance Hardin had ordered. No mob assemblies, mandatory holding and hearing, severe penalties for extrajudicial violence. Cullum, still sheriff, read it aloud monthly in the square, until even drunks could quote it. He also kept Megan's fire map pinned in the jail office and sent deputies to pump drills every first Monday. In spring, they widened 2 lanes exactly where she'd marked 3 years prior and lined them with gravel breaks. In summer, every roof in town had spark screens by code, including the courthouse. Children learned trenching before cursive. Years later, travelers would call Red Bluff overcautious, fortified, fussy with water keys and fire watches. Locals would shrug and say, "We bury pipe before we need pipe." On the anniversary of Mateo Salazar's death, the courthouse bell rang at dusk. The first toll was for Mateo. The second, by town vote and Megan's visible irritation, was for the law we almost missed, which everyone understood meant the quiet blacksmith who left, the woman who stayed, and the mercy that kept them alive long enough to learn. On the 10th anniversary, Megan stood at the back of the crowd, while Lila Finch, now journeyman Smith, sleeves rolled, forearms roped with muscle, rang the bell rope herself. Thomas, now foreman of the municipal pump crew, held the attendance slate with apprentices' names: Ruiz, Finch, Casa, Yazzie, Booker, Salazar. After the second toll, a little boy tugged Megan's skirt. "Miss Jordan," he whispered, "is it true folks used to make fun of your berms?" She looked down at him, then out at the town. Blackened scars long built over. Cellar hatches hidden neat under painted floors. Water points marked with iron rings everyone could find in smoke. She said. "Still might if they're bored. Why'd you help them anyway?" Megan watched Eli across the square, closing the forge doors for Sunday. Same deliberate motion as always. "Because weather doesn't ask who deserves saving," she said. "So we don't either." The boy considered this, solemn as a judge, then nodded and ran off toward the pump yard where older kids were arguing over crank pace. Megan stayed until the square emptied and the evening cooled enough to smell dust instead of ash. Then she walked home past berms now trimmed and maintained by ordnance, past roofs that gleamed with mesh in moonlight, past a town still imperfect and still alive. At her gate she paused, listening. From down Main came a familiar sound, clear in the dark. Eli's hammer, one last strike before banked coals, ringing out steady as a promise kept.